because what I'm going to try and do is talk theory a bit, but the theory, I hope, is stuff that has been developed ground up. It's not the usual way round, as in coming up with a hypothesis and then testing it. It's definitely tripping over things and then wondering why it is as it is. So I'm going to be suggesting some theoretical ideas that I hope are relevant to this theme, and giving one or two practical examples of small case studies that I know of. And as Karen's already pointed out, Harry, who I can't see suddenly, oh, there you are, is very kindly going to offer a great case study sometime either before tea or after tea, and is being very flexible, very agile, and high-performing about when she does it. So with that in mind, please feel free, if there's an absolutely burning thing you'd like to comment on or ask as we go through. But otherwise, the idea is that I try and gallop through some of these slides at least to cover some of this ground. And the two key ideas I'm going to try and cover are to do with high performance in organisational terms. I'm going to be arguing that I think any organisation of any size these days probably needs to think in terms of agility. I'll unpack a bit what I mean by that. That no organisation is mistress or master of its own destiny, except it is up to a point. So it's a dynamic system that the NHS and its component parts are operating within. And so agility is required to adapt to both constraints and demands, and also have some choice about what you do that actually prepares you for a sustainable future. And I'm arguing that there are infinite numbers of ways in which, whether yours is an HR role with an OD understanding, or a pure OD role, or a service improvement role, whatever your role is, arguably the difference you can make to trying to achieve sustainable high performance could be at individual level, group level, unit level, whole institution level, governance level. It's for you to know where you want to make a difference. I always come up with this little story from Reader's Digest circa 1957. The idea was that when the first ironclad ships were built, Brunel and all that, the Great Eastern was launched, and everybody was very impressed that this ship could even float, but very concerned that Brunel had invented this special new thing called a propeller, as opposed to great paddles, because this ship was supposed to cross the Atlantic, and paddle steamers didn't do too well at that. And they were very puzzled because there was a strange banging noise coming from a part of the ship nowhere near the engine and the propeller. And so everybody tried to diagnose the situation, looked at the organisation as a whole system, the ship I mean, and eventually gave up. Even Brunel came and had a look, couldn't figure out where it came from, this noise. So eventually it was a tradesman, a plumber in the Bristol shipyard, who came along, got out his little earpiece, got a tiny hammer out of his kit bag, and went tap against the wall, nowhere near where the sound was coming from. And miraculously, the sound ceased. Great, marvellous, until the shipyard owner received this chap's bill, which was for £100 in pre-Victorian England, virtually. Astonishing. So shocked was the shipyard owner, he summoned the tradesman, the plumber, and said, "Explain yourself, man." And he said, well, Governor, I can't do a Bristol accent, but he said something like, "Yes, it is a steep bill, and I'm actually, you'll be pleased to know, only charging you £1 for the tap, but I'm charging you £99 for knowing where to tap." And the point being, as we know, in a complex system, in an ever-changing environment, we can never be sure where to tap. We can never be sure whether that intervention is going to produce these reverberations. Is the butterfly going to flap its wings in the right way and create positive winds of change in our institution? But we can use our judgment, our instincts, our observations, and hopefully our networks and our communities to create, if you like, more willingness to produce the kinds of movement that you want to see that might lead to sustainable high performance. So with all that said, prepare to be drummed into submission. And notice, by the way, on my title I put ODHR. They're not the same thing, but they are different capabilities that I think are very nicely dovetailed. Very ambitious, but basically I'm saying I'm going to look at agility. Oh, and I should apologise again. I'm being very mea culpa here. As I said, the slides you got may or may not, as I said before, be in the pack. So if you are a stickler for the lot, Leanne has said you can know, well, in fact, Karen said it'll go on the website, then you can get it later. It's just the intensive slides with photos on have had to come out. So it's, what do I mean by agility? Why is it relevant to the NHS? In particular, one of the key elements of agility for me is people being willing and able to do what they're meant to be doing anyway, to the best of their ability, over and over again. What we now think of as employee engagement. So I'm going to also talk through a model for employee engagement, and then ask you to think after tea, what, if anything, does that mean in your context? And are there any particular things that you can share with everybody else that's going on in your context that might actually add to the theory? In which case I'll note them down and make sure it goes in the next book. So, drivers for change. We don't need to go through these, as much as I do about, some of the global challenges, the economic challenges, the way in which technology is transforming work, the way we communicate, etc., people's expectations about just about everything, most particularly speed of response. Patients, other service users, they're the same. They expect everything, as we all do as consumers now, preferably cheaper, faster, better, tailored to them. And the fact that there's a limited pot is largely not irrelevant. But, so we're in a context where we've got massive demands, constraints that are real. And that's the leadership space, of course, isn't it? Where and how you deal with that. The so-called aware customer patient, this is Mei-Yan Chung-Judge's slide, where people are now much more aware of their rights. As I said, they're clearer about their expectations. The pressures on the service deliverers are enormous. And at the same time, some of the things that we think of as hygiene factors. Are the junior doctors striking today? The balloting. Okay, so it's like, the pressures are within, external, all round us to produce something that works, and it's not easy at all. So in this context of ongoing change and pressure for cheaper, better, faster, but with excellent outcomes, normally the default position is change. We've got to axe jobs, we've got to innovate, we've got to do all these things. And my argument is that very often it's the way we change that undermines our ability to keep on changing and performing. So ODHR, for me, has got to, as its central mantra, have how do we build the capacity to change in this organisation so that it's not seen as, some bizarre, unnatural act, but actually part of our DNA. Just as our science is evolving and people's expectations are evolving, our ability to change is also evolving and learn from what's working and what's not working, to experiment, to test, develop new routines. Because we cannot predict what's going to happen, we've got to be able to learn. So notions of agility, I think, are relevant in this case. I came up with some stuff about agility about 3 or 4 years ago when I was writing that little book there, The Agile Organisation. That's not meant to be a plug, by the way. But I was asked to speak because I do quite a lot of work with universities. and I was asked to speak at a summit of vice-chancellors. And the then head of the Russell Group confederation, if you like, of the research-intensive universities, after I'd done my little spiel about, I think all organisations will in future need to develop greater agility, this chap stood up and said, well, thank you very much, Linda, but I think those of us, in Oxford and Cambridge, been in business since about the 14th century, we don't need to think too much in terms of agility so much as evolution, gentle. That same person last year, before he stepped down from that role, said, I heard him actually speaking to an audience saying, as a sector, we have to be agile. I thought, oh, hang on, it's only 3 years since he said rubbish. So there is something about learning from, and I think a lot of the principles around agility are from the commercial world, from private sector organisations. So please ignore notions of competitive advantage. You're talking about the value that you produce here. But it's about getting ahead of the game, gaining the ability to deliver what you do outstandingly well by intelligently, individually and collectively, quickly, rapidly, again, not in 5 years' time if you can avoid it, and proactively seizing opportunities and reacting to threats. So in a sense, it's almost like, well, we can't predict what the latest politician's point of view is going to be, but we can predict that technology is going to change certain types of work. There are various things that we can look at and be prepared for. And the ability of a business to adapt rapidly, that's the change ability I was talking about, that is the really hard part, because changing to a more proactive stance is easier than bringing about the changes, however willing people normally would be, in efficient, productive and cost-effective ways. And those are some of the key concepts that link with the notion of agility. It's an organisation-wide thing. You can have a little bit over here that's doing really brilliantly, but if it just remains a little bit over there, you won't reap as much benefit as if it's a whole organisation thing, where you're tapping into the resources across the organisation. So it's integrated, it's intelligent, as in working on the assumption that top management will no longer have all the answers if they ever did. They alone cannot in a complex world. So part of the intelligence is, how do you capture the collective intelligence? Not that everybody else who's paid a lot less is expected to come up with the executive direction, but at least they may have views about what's not working and how we could implement that what that we want to do or are told we must. It's proactive, innovative. Again, innovation is often almost incompatible with cost efficiency. Years ago, I did a case study when I was looking at mergers, starting to look at mergers in the 90s. Went back to the early merger between Glaxo and Wellcome. So it's right back to the beginning of the 90s to talk with some of the people who'd been through the process and learn from that when we were scoping the project we were doing. And apparently, one of the things that happened was that all the Wellcome scientists survived the merger. It was an acquisition dressed up as a merger. And Glaxo wanted Wellcome because, as a marketing manufacturing organ, they wanted these brain boxes willing to, carry on producing all these innovative new products and drugs and so on. But after they'd been acquired, and nobody lost their jobs, as I say, apart from a few senior management in Wellcome, what happened was that the rate of innovation, the logging of new potential drugs and so on, dropped. However they measured it, it dropped significantly. And so one of the rare survivors from the senior management was the HR director. That's, as you know, folks, rather unusual. And he was summoned to the new board and they said, what's happening? We thought we were getting a whole load of outstanding people. Where we sold a pup here. Why is there no innovation happening, or very little? And the phrase this chap used was, well, they're burying their babies. They're keeping, in other words, their best stuff to themselves, because until they think they can trust you, why would they give their best ideas to you? They might want to jump ship. There's no commitment there. It's been done through compliance. Why would they? And that's the point. You don't know what you don't know. You don't know what you're missing. And it's that magic piece around how do people willingly give of their best? What are the preconditions, if you like, given that we're all different? But in general, what needs to be in place in the way people are treated to enable them to want to give of their best? So if you look at it, though, I mean, there are loads of barriers to agility. And I'm sorry, this should be much more interactive. But I was just too greedy. I had all these slides and I was determined you were going to be drummed into submission. But, you know, I don't know if any of these would apply to anybody here, but, you know, one of the classics is the bureaucratic culture, you know, checkers checking checkers, anything gets slowed down. I put in political punchball. Sorry, that was just because, oh dear NHSEs, isn't it? You know, it's... So you're in a sort of relatively short-termist scenario. But mindsets, particularly executive mindsets, seem to be quite a significant common set of barrier, according to many of the research projects that have begun in the last few years on this topic, and some of my own research. It's almost as if the kind of model of executive management as promoted by business schools since the 80s when business schools began is one where, you know, it's linear thinking based, it's around control and projection, it's around external factors more than internal factors, etc. None of that's wrong. The issue is it's just that people may not be looking in the right way at what the capability within the organisation is, especially when they're told you've just got to save money. Where do we look to save money? Don't bother me with, but we've got some fantastic people doing brilliant things, you know. So barriers to agility, put at the bottom, a disengaged, demoralised workforce. These are generic. I'm not sure, does this apply to the NHS more generally? Certainly applies to the police. You know, I mean, if you look at most sectors, you'll find general trends, but in certain specifics, you get more of it than others. And again, it's worth looking at why that is. And loads of surveys suggest that, you know, this is the Aon Hewitt. This is, they've done another one since then, actually. This is 2013, suggesting that what they call the best employers, the ones who achieve great results in their particular business, happen generally to have higher levels of engagement on the factors that they measure than so-called average equivalents in their sectors. And so there are quite significant, so their argument is, of course, that highly engaged employees tend to contribute to higher performance. You could argue the same is true in reverse as well, that highly successful organisations tend to make people feel good being part of. There's more investment in training and development, etc., etc. So whether it's chicken or egg, I don't know. But there is something about significant differences between average employers and those that seem to be able to achieve sustainable business results. So one of the things I looked at, going back to chatting with one or two people before lunch about engagement, I know this is one of Harry's key interests. You know, again, this sounds like I'm just selling books. I am not selling books. In fact, I didn't have one to bring along, but I wrote a book with a chap called Geoffrey Matthews, who's now he's Vice President of HR for Nestle. So he's gone straight from where he was before, which was Merck. So he's gone from health to decadence in his career move. Sorry. Gosh, I've forgotten this is being recorded. sorry, Jeff. Anyway, so we were both interested in this topic and we did some research. I'd got a lot of research as well that I could draw on from my time at Roffey Park. And the top three blobs of this little model are not mine at all, they are not ours at all. These are a chap called Kahn, writing in 1990, who argued that it doesn't matter which instrument you choose to use around employee engagement, it doesn't matter, you know, whether it's Aon Hewitt, Gallup, you name it, or your own. You're more likely than not to find that the elements in it relate to the things that are thought to lead people most obviously to the so-called state of engagement, as defined by Csikszentmihalyi. That's the state where you're in flow. Flow, it sounds rather messy. It's, where you're so pleasurably immersed in what you're doing that you don't notice time passing. Assuming, therefore, that you are doing brilliantly in what you're doing, which again is an assumption. You can love what you're doing, but be doing rubbish as well, I think. But he argued that certain things need to be there. First of all, you need to have an intellectual connection with the organisation. So it's more than just the job. This is with the organisation. So you've got to know what your job is, how it fits in with the purpose of the organisation. You need to have a link between what you're doing and what the organisation is trying to do, and the link needs to work both ways. So you need to know what you're contributing is, what difference is it making. So it's the old feedback thing, learning stuff that we know is always very difficult to do. Chances to grow, if you like, in all sorts of skills and other ways. Social, is this a club I'd want to be part of anyway? Do I work with good teams? Do I feel part of an organisation doing good things? Do I like it here? All those kinds of things. Emotional, Kahn argued this is the most pivotal thing. Whoever you are, whatever age, stage, etc., we're all emotional beings, even if we hide it well or not well. And the argument is that the emotional bit is the heart of engagement for Kahn. It's, do I feel valued, even recognised, particularly by leaders and managers? Do people even know that I exist? And by the way, more than recognised, the return is, do I care? Because the argument is, if I don't care, I'm probably not terribly engaged in the organisation. So it's a two-way street. I agree with those blobs, actually, because as I say, we analysed 26 different types of instrument on engagement, and almost all the factors fitted into those three blobs. But at the time, I was working for somewhere called the Work Foundation, and we had this notion of good work. Good work is, I guess, providing a context where people feel fairly treated and want to give of their best. And we tried these two principles of good work against these three blobs to say, well, in an ideal world, everybody has those three blobs in their own jobs, but actually the world doesn't stop spinning. Things change. And as they change, you can have perfect understanding of what your job is. You can even be growing in it, but if suddenly things change and you're not informed about what's happening, or by the way, you have a view about what's happening and nobody bothers to listen to you, you can have all those wonderful three blobs, but you won't be engaged as much anymore. And in particular, if what's happening and the way it's happening is perceived to be unfair, equity is the other principle. Now, everybody's got their own version of what fairness means. And interestingly, it's not equal, because most people accept that, some people are more effective than others or whatever. It seems to be that the principle, though, of fairness is terribly important to most people. And that's, again, you can't get inside people's heads. But those two are moderators of those three things. So if you want what we're talking about in terms of engagement to get agility, to get performance, you want more than people being engaged with their job. Because if they love their job, we want people to be engaged with their job, obviously. They will want to go the extra mile. They will want to help patients. But if they're not engaged with the organisation, if there's no connection with the organisation, they will actually resent it like mad if the organisation wants to do something that interferes with what they believe their job is about. Does that make sense? So we'll come back to that a little later. And in other words, we used to talk in terms of psychological contract, fair dealing, etc. That unspoken set of expectations we have of one another, often reflected in contracts of employment, not the psychological bits, but the shaping of expectations, what we require of you, as well as what you'll get when you come here. And of course, as soon as people arrive and it's different, you start to get that undermining bit. Going back to what people want generally, you can find the psychological contract in a context where you cannot necessarily rule the world and say, this is who we are, come and join us, and by the way, we can deliver all the time. It's almost like there probably needs to be a different kind of psychological contract conversation happening when you bring people into the organisation. It's about getting real, so that I'm not saying therefore people won't be disappointed, but it is about being somewhat grown up about the world is changing. An example of this is came across a wonderful recruitment video for EY, or used to be known as Ernst & Young, about 2 years ago. They don't lack recruits. I mean, don't get me wrong, you know, people still, even though in theory all graduates now want to work for young entrepreneurial companies and so on. But nevertheless, EY has thousands of people wanting to work for it every year. But they did this video to kind of help people self-select out of applying. And what they said, you know, it was quite explicit to begin with. It says, come and work for EY, and we guarantee, shouldn't guarantee anything, we guarantee that you will not end your career with us. That you won't work for us for very long. But the deal is, if you work really hard, and if you've got the skills that we think you've got, and if you really deliver to customers and clients or whatever, in return, we'll develop you like mad. You'll get access to all sorts. You'll form part of an alumni group through whom probably you'll get your next job. Can't guarantee, it's up to you to make it, but we'll give you the possibility of making your own career. And I thought, well, that's nice, that's good, because they're not conning people into thinking, oh, I'm there now, you know, I just peel my grapes for the next 20 years and Bob's your uncle. Anyway, so I'm arguing that engagement and the factors that lead to it are part of the sustainability element. It's in a very volatile context how you can get people willing and able to go through the change without overly being damaged by it, willing and able to understand what's needed now and give their best ideas to what's needed now. And that I term, it's not my term, it's not only individual resilience, you know, which you've talked about, I think, on a previous occasion, it's organisational capacity for resilience. In the literature, this comes over as, in a fast-changing world, you need to make your decisions faster, therefore you won't necessarily get them right all the time. Even if you make them slowly, you won't get them right all the time, but we tend to ignore that. Someone gets hung out to dry and then sacked, and then we carry on. Resilience, or the Americans call it resiliency, is about the robustness of the system, the ability of the system to learn from its mistakes and to recover and to be willing to experiment and test, and then, having done that, sift the wheat from the chaff and start to create the new from that. In commercial world, we used to think in terms of sustainable competitive advantage, which a lot of organisations used to think they had. And now Rita Gunter-McGrath, one of the American OD gurus you may have come across, she says, forget it. There's no such thing as one set of sustainable competitive advantages, because your customers today they'll probably, you know, want something else completely tomorrow. Look at building societies. I've worked with a lot of building societies, particularly 2 or 3 mutuals who I love. They still have branches in the high street. They still, some of them, have pass books. So, you know, customer goes in with a pile of cash, cashier puts a stamp in the... Do you remember this, you know, from yesteryear? If you want a mortgage, you know, you make an appointment and maybe in a week or 2 speak with the mortgage person. Well, they've had to recognise the fact that the world is changing, and by the way, the demographic of their customer base used to all that is now, shall we say, in their 3rd age, and is not a very sustainable business model. So they're having to rethink through digital how they will do the kinds of things that banks have been doing for a long time. But by the way, what's unique about them is they've recognised, they've done their research, they've recognised that having a branch presence is very important. Still, even Amazon are going in for branches now. But what they're doing is different services, higher value added services. So it's no longer cashiers counting your money behind it. So your mortgage broker may be based in London, but you go in when it suits you. You can have a Skype, or not Skype, it's a secure communication, video communication when it suits you. Your deal will be worked out there and then, etc. So the point being, Gunter McGrath says, think transient advantages, and in the context of the NHS, think new treatments, new ways of working, ways in which we need to equip ourselves for the future, because it won't just be one. We'll actually be bombarded with plenty. But on the other hand, we need to make it possible for people to know what's going on, what's important. Ergo, you know, how can we help communications work really brilliantly? How can we involve people to the extent that they get it? How can we get other people besides ourselves anticipating some of these trends? How can we, you know, well, people, if we remain connected, will take the journey if they still believe in the purpose of the organisation, if they've not been so drummed down by those barriers to agility, the bureaucracy, the bad press, etc., that they could only see the trees, not the wood. So how do we reconnect to the core purpose? And employee engagement and well-being is key. So that's it, really. That's no probs. As we know, it's not quite so simple. And here, I think, this little framework, it's this is from project management. Agility is often thought of as, oh, it's a bunch of agile techniques from software development or project management. There's a bit of that, you know, because they've been doing it for 20 odd years or so, but they're just a bunch of useful techniques, and commend them, and we should be applying them to our own practice. But even project managers, sorry, that sounds a very sweeping stereotype, but it's project managers saying, it's people and culture far more than the tools and the processes that equate to agility. And so what do we mean by an agile culture? These are some characteristics that I noted from years and years of employee surveys that I used to look at, used to do at Roffey Park. A culture that has got that changeability in its DNA, that enables learning, innovation, you know, that works across its boundaries to do that, as well as within its silos, preferably isn't siloed. So people's mindsets are, yeah, I'm doing this bit here, deep dive here, but I'm also part of other teams. I should be sharing this knowledge somehow, where the work itself is stimulating to people. You know, they're getting that feedback, they think it's great, they're learning from it. It feels a good place to work, so they're not expected. That's why I think the junior doctors and the negotiations over pay, etc. Is it pay? Is it hours? What is it? It's what does a great place to work mean? And values-based, as I say, since 1994, I did annual surveys of people through Roffey Park. We called this survey the Management Agenda. And we asked people, they weren't all managers by any means, professionals mostly, and managers, what was going on in their organisations and what do they think about certain things. So these elements, apart from the values-based, between 1994 and 2000, were the ones that they were commenting on. The values-based thing came through much more strongly from about 2000 and remains strong in the latest management agendas. That people really do seem to want to connect, both with the ethics. They don't want any gaps between walks and it's all very, if you like, motherhood and apple pie, an ideal world, etc. But again, it's those deep holes of intent and behaviour through which trust evaporates. So let's talk org design related to this. What does an agile structure look like? What does agile work practice look like? This is work done by the University of Southern California, Christopher Worley and others. What they say is, from their many studies, that an agile organisation aims to get flat. They are the more democratic type of organisations and pretty lean, you know. So it's not like suddenly we've got zillions of staff. It's not that. But what we're getting is more, not more for less, but more from fewer, willingly, which is, for me, different from more for less. The strong cross-organisational collaboration, lateral teams driving performance and decision-making, because they're working whole processes. They're looking across the boundaries to see where the problems are. A good example of this is in the American healthcare system. A lot of them have got into process improvement since Obamacare came in, because they recognise that to maintain their margins, where they're not getting as much for Obamacare as for their usual, they're not getting as much income, so they have to look at how how they do things to make sure they can still produce great patient outcomes, but it's not as costly. And Virginia Mason, if you check out their website, if you haven't seen it before, it's got all sorts of tools. Their principal approach is to look at the end-to-end customer process or patient process. Someone comes in here, goes out there, better. What are the key stages of all that? Who's involved? Everybody who works for Virginia Mason has this drummed into them. They know exactly who plays what part in this process. And it's down to the smallest possible set of actions that are must-do actions. So that when emergencies happen or where innovation is required, the surgeon or whoever involved in that part of the process knows intimately that all the other things have happened that should have happened. There's no need for rework in theory. There's no misunderstanding. So the argument is that, if you're really good at driving performance horizontally, you get the chance to then be much more tailored in the care you give. And very much clear responsibilities and decision-making, sharing, learning, experimenting, testing, benchmarking, leveraging knowledge and resources across units. Sorry about the Americanese. Active involvement and participation, etc. That's because they think those 4 qualities, if you like, on the end. Leaders who can provide direction but are more about coaching and developing team capability. And that almost applies from the top down, really. It's about having a more leadership-type culture at all levels. And in a complex environment where the world's changing all the time, this is about having conversations with people, enabling people to start to grapple with some of the things that are not very clear. Getting clear on those things, recognising we won't get things right all the time. So there are ways in which we can reflect on what's not working as well as what's working, not in a blame culture way, but in a learning way. And as a result, you get staff members understanding what's required and willing to do that. So from an org design point of view, University of Southern California would say, well, start with your leaders, look at your structures, look at your core processes, look at your communications and your decision-making styles to support that. So if you wanted to know where to tap, there's a few thoughts. Here's another thought. This is my little model, which was built on someone else's model, Meredith and Francis, about 1999. And I'm basically saying here that alongside this culture, which is, as I say, more vibrant, more integrated, looking beyond the silos, sharing, learning, experimenting, testing, but always with the patient care, good outcomes for patients as the central driver. That notion of the top left quadrant, strategizing, is saying that because of the ambiguity we're in and the constant interactions between the system, the external system and the organisation, just coming up with our one-year business plan and our 3-4 year corporate plan, whatever you have in your institutions, is no longer enough. Because normally there's a big gap between we've done the plan, then we struggle on implementation. And by the way, it's usually just shoved away in a drawer, so people may not even know about it. All they get is a load of KPIs or targets or measures. And remembering, as we do in OD, that, again, all these stereotypical thoughts, I've got a slide in your pack somewhere, that, you know, yeah, you can bring about change, typically from the top or typically by external force, but that's change by compliance as opposed to change by willing consent, if you like, commitment. And the trick, if there is a trick, is how do you bring about change that is imposed on you, but in a way that you can own it, that people can own it, want to do it anyway, don't feel diminished by it, and you can also deliver what you're expected to deliver in the language that is required. So I'm not saying, you know, okay, if you've got all these targets, make up some others that work for you. But there is something about vital that managers and leaders in particular can think creatively about when we've got things that we've got to do, how can we do this in a way that we can get behind it and really want to do it. So it's more of a continuous process. It's a lot of dialogue, a lot of conversation, a lot of facilitation of team discussions and inter-team discussions about what's changing, why is it changing. Delivery is, as a result, easier because people understand what we're trying to do and why. So the gap is smaller between what we're intending to do and what we do. And some of the techniques that link with agile project management and agile software development, I think are totally relevant. I mean, things like, you know, the old project management, which was, we're going to put a new IT system in the NHS. It'll be delivered in 5 years and it'll cost £3 million or something. And we all know what happens in scenarios like that. I mean, it's not that there's anything wrong with anything anybody does there. It's just it's unrealistic nowadays to expect that. Things are too complex. But arguably breaking things down into much shorter cycles, break the big intent down into iterative cycles where there's a lot of feedback, where patients and end users are involved in each stage, means you probably tack a little bit here or you move over there, but you're broadly moving in the right direction. You get the funding as you go along. And things like, I mentioned, I gave you the Virginia Mason example. It's sort of getting the things right that need to be right, that everybody needs to know, so we don't even really need to think about it. We can be confident in those. We don't need to gear all our systems to punishing the one or two people who don't do it. But in practice, we want also some innovation, some initiative. So we gear what we're trying to do to all our systems and processes to what we're trying to do on top of what is core. And the linkages, again, those working across boundaries. And in some cases, it's harder to work across internal boundaries than to work across organisational boundaries. The people element of that, you can imagine, is where I'm sure we're all most interested. You have got the breakdown. In fact, you've even got a copy of this model. I may have changed it again since I wrote that book, I don't know. But basically it's just saying you need to have everybody involved, thinking what's happening, sharing their patient insight, going out and looking at the best practices anywhere that link to what you're trying to do. You know, not to copy slavishly, but to say, what can I learn from that might help us? So HR and OD in particular can help on strategizing, because leaders struggle with leading for complexity. They'll never admit it. Well, some do. You know, some of the banks in the recent past have recognized that they can't lead well for complexity. And there's some really interesting examples of things like Standard Chartered Bank, who didn't suffer as much during the crash. They've suffered a bit more recently, as all the other banks seem to, or most of the other banks seem to do. And you know, so they've been experimenting with how they develop themselves as executive groups, going in for things like facilitated, blimey, we really don't know what the next step is. We're not comfortable with it. But out of that discomfort, we might find some ways forward. And it's like learning from complexity theory. How do we handle that? How do we nevertheless, when the rest of the organisation still expects clarity of decision, Anyway, the long and short of it is that some people can make a huge difference, as the leadership development person is at Standard Chartered Bank, to helping equip the organisation with the kind of leaders it needs. Facilitating staff involvement in strategising. Harry is going to give a great example of this later on, so that people get the idea and have their chance to have their views taken into account. And by the way, you may have to wait a generation perhaps to get the kind of leaders you want, but you can certainly influence the criteria for future leaders. Bring in people who already kind of get it. I could give you endless case studies of where change has been brought out by developing the people below the executive team, who in turn put pressure on the executives to behave differently. But as I say, time isn't on our side. Agile innovation, as I said, agile problem solving and decision making. Again, if you've got people making decisions at the right levels with the right authority and the right resources, if everything has to be funneled up, you cannot respond in an agile way. So again, from an OD perspective, you need to know who does what, how are jobs designed, are the accountabilities commensurate with what the job is about and the resources for that job and the skills that the people have in those jobs. Because people often get hammered into the ground with the things they're meant to be able to do and they can't do them, And it may be a system blockage, it's not their skill, it's just they can't get the information they need. NHS is lousy, for information flow. That's the stereotype, and there are so many reports which you're more familiar with than me that say this is the King's Fund report last year, or in 2013, highlighted information flow as a chronic deficiency. If you wanted to know where to tap, maybe in your institutions, how does it work? Do people know what to do? And disciplined innovation, again, you're looking to see team working in the wards, everywhere, if you can, if it's relevant, not as a just want to, do the right things, because not always is team working needed, but mostly it is, or an attitude of team working. And Steve Jobs of Apple is the classic example of somebody who's supposed to be a highly creative individual, or was. And yet the people, since he died, of course, there's a lot of stuff written about Apple and the creative process. And yes, he was one of the people who inputted enormously to the development of some of the products that now kind of created an industry. I bet most of us have got iPhones and iPads and things. I think I'm one of the dinosaurs who still has a BlackBerry. Mind you, I'm going to ditch it, it's rubbish. But, sorry, it'll probably blow up as we speak. But the point being that it's recognised that in Apple, the creative process, or equate it to the NHS, that the inspirational breakthrough treatment for that person or whatever, was based on teamwork, where the initial idea was worked up by a team, refined, tested, more ideas built on that it is a process. It's not an individual bright spark who finds the way forward exclusively. And if you think about agile delivery with regard to our own practice, all this, you say patient-centric, working back, all the stuff about aligned to the business strategy. Well, you're aligned to the outcomes for patients, in theory, and in practice, I'm sure. But if you work back through the chain, do the people in the organisation get the service that they need to give their where are you in the value chain, sort of thing? And these are just some of the many trends that are being embraced, that if you can get all sorts of things via social media or via the internet, why would people want a clunky old something policy that's not fit for purpose, and clogs the works up, or no reliable advice or whatever? As I say, I'm not saying you do this, I'm saying these are generic issues that are picked up elsewhere. And the King's Fund, it was 2012 actually, that report, going back to the linkages, saying one thing you can guarantee about this environment is that if you want efficiency of care and quality, it's not going to be one institution alone that delivers it. Again, I don't know whether you feel enabled to think, It's not from ward to board, it's more from ward to home and the follow-up care. There's a whole infrastructure of things that your bit of the action may not fit with. But I hope someone somewhere, despite the complexity of budgets, is working, demanding new levels of cooperation and partnership working across whole systems. Does that reflect? Yeah, so, and that's hard. You know, and again, research we did at ROFI for years into so-called strategic alliances and partnership working, joint ventures at one end to informal networks at the other, and all the shades of grey in between. These are tricky boundaries. We were talking a bit over lunch at the lunch table I had the pleasure of joining, you know, about how very often people representing their organisation in a partnership arrangement, they have their own budget, they know what their own organisation's needs are, and the pressures that they'll be under are to deliver, usually, for their institution. It's very hard to think the bigger picture, and maybe I make a sacrifice here, and then I've got to sell it to my grumpy stakeholders who think it's only about my bit, you know. So these are very challenging things. I just remember one chap who, there are a set of behaviours, and if you want to look them up, they're I actually wrote an article in 2012, I think, that appeared in the Perspectives in Public Health or something. I want to look it up, but it's an article about, I was interested in when the GP consortia, as they used to be called, were being formed, and I was arguing that actually it would be quite good if some of these principles and skills were developed to enable that, and that particular article still keeps on coming back to haunt me. You know, I must talk about it a lot, and I think there are some useful hints on what can help in that scenario. But I just remember little behaviours like UK TV. Do you remember when, before digital TV channels came along, do you remember where you had a choice of like 4 and felt grateful for it if there was something you liked to watch? When the first collaboration I came across here was between UK TV, that was a channel, Telewest, it's called FlexTech as well, it changed now, an American digital provider who could see the wealth of wonderful programmes tucked away in the BBC's archives. So the BBC was their prime desired partner. And they'd been in negotiation to get access to, and the BBC was happy to sell these programmes. I mean, it makes its money largely, not through the licence fee, but through selling programmes abroad. So they dealt with the commercial arm of the BBC, and it took 5 years of complex, difficult, legalistic, this was mostly the BBC, negotiations before the deal was done. By the time the deal was done, relations were so fraught, they had to change all the players involved because it wouldn't have worked. So the chap who did become the BBC, it became the head of this joint venture, his name was Dick Emery, which is anyone old enough to remember another Dick Emery. It's not the same one, you'll be relieved to know. And he deliberately took himself to the FlexTech or Telewest offices and said, we'll base it there, because they didn't have the option of having a separate place. And everything was working against trust, you know, like the BBC employees couldn't even get in because their security, you know. And it was all about, do we share, even though it's a joint venture, do we share access to our software and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, the point being, he brought about what has since become the most amazing collaboration and has created the digital industry, if you like. Because he said, I'm going to take a few risks here. I know I shouldn't do this, you know, BBC. Again, keep on forgetting that this camera's rolling. But he took the risk of saying, to build trust with my American counterpart here, I'm going to give away more information than I should, but that will be helpful to this chap and allow him to then tailor his service, if you like, to what I think will work for the BBC. But I've got to trust that he's not going to abuse this because he could very easily make a mint out of this information. And the phrase that was used for this kind of behaviour was gifting. And he took the risk because he said, well, I'll know if I get shafted that this isn't going to work. And maybe they'll need a different head of this outfit. Well, not inevitably, as it happened, it worked brilliantly. And it's those kinds of things that are around the complexities of working in linkages, in partnerships, that again, if one only tapped in a certain area, you could look at ways in which collaboration does or doesn't happen, even between the tribes. You know, what is it that people need to be sharing together and developing together, and how do we enable some of that? So, so here are some suggestions, you know, facilitate cross-boundary team working, implement diversity policies, implement them, not only develop them, etc. Build team working, genuine team working. Work with teams managers to address morale issues. For instance, it's a case study that's been written up a number of times now. It's an NHS case study of Doncaster and Bassetlaw. And there they had a very underperforming ward. You know, there were not great outcomes for patients in that ward. It could be that, that was how it was meant to be, but basically the ward staff were very, very demoralised. And also, not turning up for work. Very often it had sickness records that would make you think that, blimey, they should be patients, not staff, you know. And they got more complaints, disproportionately more complaints, from patients and patients' families than any other ward. And rather than just sort of take the big axe, the then OD lead, she's since gone on and set up her own company, worked with the ward sister, who in one way was sort of seen by the ward staff as part of the problem, but they worked together to come up with a process that to you or I, it's a very, very simple process. It would relate to emotional intelligence and appreciative inquiry. So if you take those two notions, the idea of it was that every member of staff on that ward was interviewed by the OD consultant to find out what they deeply cared about. Then an appreciative inquiry exercise took place where, again, the emphasis was less on the things that we're doing wrong, but what we can do right. The intervention essentially involved a number of got the movement happening. Even ward staff had the opportunity, should I say, to spend 24 hours in the ward as a patient. So they each took it in turns to be in the patient's shoes, literally sleeping there, etc. And the long and short of it was that it was the road to Damascus experience. Lots of little mechanisms, like instead of the wall of shame where all these complaints were, they rebadged and they were suddenly getting all these appreciative, the ward outcomes improved dramatically, etc. So it doesn't have to be rocket science, but it's around where do you want to tap that can make the most difference. And arguably you could say, well, team working, making sure the team, it's not just their interpersonal behaviours that are the issue, is the workload, right? Working with those responsible for workload to make sure, if at all possible, that some of those issues can be addressed as well. Otherwise, it's like you're blaming the victims. And this is another example. Sorry it's so small, but it's very difficult to get it on. Essentially, this was the Calderdale and Huddersfield NHS Trust set up 23 self-managing teams. Notice flatter structure, working across boundaries, each under trained team coordinators. Some of those were previously the manager or the ward sister or whatever. But they were trained really in how to facilitate and enable the team to make decisions and to deliver. And they get infrastructure support from the centre including from 3 senior managers who interestingly provide the right kind of attention. They want to know, how are things improving? What breakthroughs have we had? It's the thing about what leaders pay attention to is what you tend to get. And very often, of course, it's only to the what's not working bit. They have weekly support meetings that promote inter-team communication and collaboration, as well as intra-team communication. And as you can see, if you can see, there are a lot of benefits that come out of that in terms of the measurable targets that they have to achieve, but also reduce sickness absent rates of staff. So again, where would you pay attention? So there's the wheel. Should be called Catherine, shouldn't it, after yesterday? But you can see I'm building finally. Are you still alive out there, by the way? Is this too much? I did warn you, didn't I? I'm sorry. So this final quadrant, the people piece, I think actually this is why I don't still like this model, because for me the people bit runs all the way through. And I do think it's more than the 70%, it's everything really. But you can have the tools, you can have the shifting mindsets, you can have different decision-making styles, etc. And so this is assuming that people are willing to be flexible. If you're about agility, sorry?
No, I'm just echoing the willing bit.
Willing, yeah. And this is where you, as you can tell, I'm leading back to engagement. The willingness, the high-performance work climate, adaptable structure, rich roles, in other words, where people have some satisfaction, growth, etc. Effective change management and developing the change capability, so it's not just imposed on them. So people are involved, they're learning continuously, and by the way, they're right to trust their leaders, as opposed to being told, we're values-based now, you can trust us. I think there is something there about grow up. So there it is. And I'm arguing that the foundation of this is a felt fair psychological contract. It doesn't have to be, everybody suddenly gets a massive pay hike, though that would be lovely. It's more about, do people feel that they're getting what they want? Is the organisation clear what it wants from them? Are the feedback loops working? And the things that are impediments to that sense of fairness are named, and people are encouraged to think about, we've got real constraints here, our hands are very much tied, there's a limit to what we can do, but at least we'll show a willingness to listen. And by the way, if you get all that, we expect even more. This isn't about, I was chairing a panel at an HR conference about 2 or 3 months ago. This was HR directors from all sectors. And on the panel was a guy who started a communications agency about 10 years ago, and he's built it up to have 300 staff and fantastic products and services. It's a very well-known agency. And he put a slide up in his 10 minutes bit, which had got every conceivable sweetie you could imagine, like pay hikes, lengthy holidays, creche, gym membership, you name it. Everything that in an ideal world you'd say, well, those are things that would help with engagement. And his challenge to the audience, or his question, he was genuinely asking for help from the audience, because they were all HR. He said, look, can anyone explain to me, is there anything missing there that you would suggest for engaging people? They were all extrinsic motivators, of course. So we all went, maybe this, maybe that. You say, oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, we did try that as well. So can anyone therefore explain to me why year after year we've gone in for one of the great engagement awards, and we've been, in the top 10 every year, but now we're number 10 and we're worried that we're going to drop out of the top 10. And the conclusion we drew was actually not that you can go too far, But there is something about, unless the engagement, it's a psychological contract. We value you and we'll do what we can to recognise you and to give you what you need and to do your job. But by the way, we do expect you to do your job, and your job is changing and growing, and doing what you were doing 3 years ago ain't it, or it's only a part of it. And it's tough, and we'll try and make it easier for you. We'll try and unblock the bureaucracy. We'll try and whatever, not P&DR you or performance review you to death. All these things are more about having a more grown-up conversation, I think, with people about what they want. So I think thinking about employee engagement, I would argue it's not really our bag. Sorry, this is, I expect to be challenged on this. I would say, yes, of course, if you believe the theory, and I do firmly, that if you feel better, if you are engaged in what you're doing, you're more likely to produce, you're more likely to care and produce great outcomes. But I think the people who influence the actual workplace on a day-to-day basis are not so much OD and HR, I think it's managers, most, and other staff. So for me, if you wanted to know where to tap on engagement, you'd look at management practice. You'd look at communications, and you'd look at how you use your information about who's feeling what, where, does it matter, what's the mood in the place, does it matter? How can we use this proactively to get ahead of the game rather than wait, oh gosh, we've got to do the engagement survey again. That's going to be another 8-month job, and then produce a massive data that everyone thinks, oh God. There is something here about these are tools to enable people to have conversations about what better looks like, as well as what works, and how we can share that. And again, that this is the Point of Care Foundation commentary. It's really about, if you want engagement and high quality patient-centred care, I think that's the nub to me of the enablers of engagement, and recognising that the people doing the work are human beings as well. I don't mean, have bleeding heart conversations every Friday, but there is something about not expecting too much, making sure that workloads can be doable, health and well-being in a meaningful sense, not a paternalistic sense, And I told you that there were 2 models. Don't worry, I'm almost out of models. So just the final few thoughts, I hope. This little framework, I mentioned this book I wrote with Jeff Matthews. And as I said, if you want job engagement, fine. Pay attention to the social, emotional and intellectual aspects of this, but most particularly the intellectual bits. But if you really want to grow engagement with the organisation beyond the work, then these things that I mentioned earlier become more important. So equity, if you notice, we put round the heart, or the sense of fairness, is pivotal to that. So therefore, some degree of transparency when decisions get made, why they're made, why so-and-so is promoted and I'm not promoted. Are we really implementing real diversity, or are we, sort of creating a context where we make it an issue rather than an enabler? How do we build trust? Well, I'm arguing that at the heart of engagement, there's got to be honesty all the way through. So the connection piece of this is where it's typically from the top, really, at one level. This is the shared purpose bit. Do we really still connect with that purpose? And if we see fat cats or whatever, we won't believe the purpose. So it's about values. It's about making sure that we're walking the talk. The brand, this is a generic thing, so that may or may not apply to you. But it's interesting, a lot of NGOs have got into brand. Just as HR is a commercial notion, really, so is branding for marketing. So does my organisation, does it have a brand that means something that I'm really proud of? Within the NHS, which I'm equally proud of. Do I get a sense of identification and community, etc.? Then I'm more likely to feel pride in the organisation, which is one of the 7 deadly sins in theory. But this is about you want people advocating what you're doing, feeling keen to tell other people about it. And that's very much around leadership being straight. I mean, this is Sytner, which is a car franchise outfit. And they're very clear on what their model of running their business is. So they know what they're doing externally, and they want the inside to be the same. They want people to be experiencing Sytner as an organisation that's honest and fair. They've got this so-called one team philosophy based on those values, etc. All motherhood and apple pie, apart from the have fun thing, which is quite nice. But the thing is, they do it. And look at this, the thing about never guarantee anything. But this is, all Sytner employees are given a unique undertaking by the group when they join, and are given the opportunity to hold the directors responsible for delivering these commitments. So they're surveyed about, are you satisfied with the way the directors are delivering their promise about providing industry-leading training and career development, promoting from within. They challenge if it's not happening, communicating regularly with all our team. So those commitments came from joint activity between employees and leaders, and the leaders are kept honest because they're held to account for delivering that. Therefore, so are staff. So I think you can do command and control around high commitment approaches. Support quadrant, that's the thing about, this is usually delivered by the manager in a day-to-day basis. This is about, again, people just feeling valued and building a high-performance work climate, quality of relations and that sense of a fair deal, particularly the well-being piece. Again, I'm sorry, I'd better not stop to tell you more case studies, but there are plenty. This, again, is the Point of Care Foundation. Their version of providing support, I think, is fine. Operationalising it through give all staff well-structured appraisals and ongoing training and support for personal and career development. Personally, that's the only thing I have trouble with, because I've not found a single appraisal scheme. That's not quite true. I've found 2 more recently that delivers more than compliance. And I'm sorry, because you all have one and you may have a very different view of it. I like to think of it as a development tool, a development process. But particularly in universities, my goodness, they are, especially when you've got the bell-shaped curve, and some of these people are virtually Nobel Prize-winning scientists, and they're I was working with some unit leader, an institute leader, doing incredibly important research, and he'd built this team up over years. And this year they've imposed the bell-shaped curve, so only 10% can go in the highest category. And so he said, I've done it, and in the process I've hacked off 3 people that it took me 5 years to recruit. And even though I value them, and I said I've been honest to them, because of course normally it goes into a norming process. So, because some people do have horns and halos, don't they, about their people. He said, you don't need to norm these any further because I've done it and I've delivered it. But I've destroyed my relationship with these people in the process. So, as I say, I'm looking for the rare examples of where a performance appraisal scheme works to the other extreme and enables people. So we can debate or arm wrestle over that. But I do think, other than that, all those points are extremely useful. And voice, again, how well can people communicate? What do they know? Who's being told what? They'll be on social media most of the time, so why wait for clunky old formal messages? Are you communicating? And more to the point, are you listening? And scope, as I said, this is a really two-way thing. This is where If people have got the skills, you've developed them, they know what their job is, let them get on and do it, give them feedback, give them growth, give them development, but get performance from them. Make that the deal. We'll do this because we value you, but we expect you to, you know. And I think it's about HR and OD working towards a new partnership, relationship with employees. One that isn't, well, we've got to, you know, like that creative agency guy, desperately thinking, what more due jaws can I offer people to get them interested? And the advice he got from the HR teams, the HR directors in the audience was, you know, when he put this slide up with about 50 different things, don't do anything now. Take away some of those benefits and start to talk more about, okay, what few things now really matter. But by the way, you've benefited as much as anything in the growth. If you want to be part of the next phase, we need more from you, and let's build the due jaws around that. So involve people in change. That's all about voice, role design. You know, there's no end really to where you can tap, and where you tap, where you choose to tap, has got to depend on the context you're in, your own preferences, though beware, of course, you know, if you come from one background or another background, disciplinary, you know, the old thing about to a hammer, every problem's the nail, you know, so don't just come out with your one-trick pony approach, you know. I say that because the case study I mentioned earlier, the person had trained very extensively in appreciative inquiry, really wanted to use it, and as it happened, it worked brilliantly in that context. It may not work everywhere. So again, it's work out what will work. There's a summary of some of the things related to that model that I think OD can do. And if you can see that, you have not only very good vision, but extrasensory perception. I hope that's in your pack, but so it's things like, you know, make sure that managers can manage and simplify workloads where possible. I know this may seem like motherhood and apple pie or impossible, but it's like, what's the end? What are you trying to contribute? Remembering the fundamental differences. In most contexts, change is compliance. You're after, within a compliance environment, gaining more commitment. And the deep changes, this is Mayan's quote from Peter Senge, the deep changes are very difficult to achieve through compliance. And so if you've got demoralised workforces, they are probably suffering from compliance overload. They're probably not getting enough what's in it for me anymore. They may have lost sight of the core purpose. So if that's the case, then arguably just find out, have chats with people. See, you know, start different conversations. How do we cope in the next few months or the next year, given the workloads? What kinds of things can we think about that might make a difference? It's not whether we can do things, it's how can we do it that helps the patient and helps us too. So if nothing more than that, I think it's about starting those conversations.